All right, so good evening, everyone, on a very, very hot, warm day here in Vienna. So my name is Eleonora Neri, and I'm International Relations Specialist here at the Vienna Institute for Global Studies. Allow me to warmly welcome you, definitely warmly, welcome you to tonight's discussion. Today will be titled, When Will the Lights Go Out in Europe? It's a scenario-based panel on Europe's energy's future, on production, consumption, technology, and competitiveness in a decade of an uncertainty. So thank you all for joining us tonight, and what promises to be a challenging and a forward-looking conversation on Europe's energy future. Europe is entering a decade that will decide whether it will remain an industrial powerhouse or slides into permanent energy dependence. Gas flows from Europe has been cut, nuclear is politically divisive, renewables are accelerating but still intermittent, and American liquid natural gas keeps European factories running at a price that erodes competitiveness every quarter. Households feel it in their bills, industry feels it in the margins, government feels it in every vote. At the heart of this event lies a very simple question, but powerful. When will the lights go out in Europe? And what can we do right now to make sure they don't? Tonight's panel discussion will focus on 5 scenarios, and I will go back to those scenarios in a moment. Before doing that, please allow me to welcome the director of this institute, Zoltán Ács, which will give some welcoming remarks before we dive into the discussion. Zoltán, you have the floor.
Thank you. Well, I thought it was going to be so hot that the energy was all going to go out already, so we have shorts on. But we still have energy. So I'm Zoltán Ács. I'm the director of the Vienna Institute. And one of the things we do is to try to organize events that deal with very relevant and interesting topics that there's lots of discussion on, but it's usually more heat than substance. Let me tell a little story to introduce this topic of why energy is so important. My colleague at Yale, Nordhaus, who won the Nobel Prize a few years ago, I don't know why they didn't give it to me too, but it's very difficult to get that. And he wrote one of the more interesting papers in probably all the social sciences. He was interested in what did it cost to light one room with a 40-watt light bulb for 4 hours, right? So this would be a minimal amount of light in a room, but that would let you do something when the sun went down, other than going to bed and having sex and increasing the population, which is what people did, for forever. And he came up with this number that was absolutely amazing. The price or the cost, either way, right, of lighting a room for 4 hours with a 40-watt light bulb from 10,000 BC. I don't know how he got the data, right, but he made it up, I'm sure, to the present fell by a factor of 10,000, right? It went from the ultimate luxury good to something that was free and we wouldn't even think about. I come from the United States. We never turn out the lights. For those of you that have visited, right, Americans never turn out the lights because it was so cheap. Europeans like, oh my God, got to turn out every light because it's expensive, right? And so when you think of that, it's amazing. So let me put it into a little more of a context. I went to the Sisi Museum recently with Naomi, as I started this institute for 2 years, I hadn't been to one museum in Vienna because we worked so hard. And I told my boss, I said, this has been disgusting. All people in this city do is go to a museum, and I just worked. So anyway, we finally went, and there was the main dining room that the emperor, right, and the empress shared, and in there was a chandelier. It had 100 candles on it. Never let truth get in the way of a good story, right? It's about 100. And it was a tall ceiling, and for dinner, they would light it. It took 7 people to let it down because it was so heavy, because it was all crystal with the lights, right? It came down, they put in all the lights, they lit it, lifted it up, and then halfway through dinner, the candles all burned down. 7 people came back, let it down again, changed all the things quickly. I guess they stopped eating. It was between courses, right? Makes sense. Then they pulled it back up again, right? And oh my God, that's what you had to do. And so energy, right, is what made the modern world possible, right? For lighting, for transport, right? Everything. So if you think of a house today without electricity, nothing works. I mean, it's unbelievable. So, right, as we look at the last 150, 200 years since the Industrial Revolution, the 19th century, right, you ask the question, what was the energy source, right? It was coal, dirty, filthy, horrible, but it also created gas, it powered the steam engine, right, heated houses. It was like amazing, right? Then in the 20th century, the predominant energy source is oil, right? Made cars go, trucks go, now trains, airplanes, jets, rockets, right? And the 21st century is the century of electricity. It took me a long time to figure this out, but I think I'm right. And of course, what's interesting, where coal, there's only one way to get it, right? You gotta dig it out and then burn it, right? Same thing with oil, you gotta pump it out and then burn it somehow. Electricity is sort of magical. We can create it many different ways, right? And as you will see here today, right, when you talk to the crazy people, they say, oh yeah, we just need windmills, and that's it, and everything will work. And then you think, well, what if the wind stops, right? Or solar and everything, right? Or there's nuclear power, or, right, solar, other things. And thanks to Elon Musk, who I know is the most popular man in the world. The only people that hate him are the press. That's true. Right. You guys know what they're going to do, right? We're going to put data centers into space. Technology is basically worked out. The cost of putting 1 kilo into space is going to fall from $4,000 to $100. So now it's economical, right? And the next step, we're going to put the generation of electricity up into satellites into space. Sounds like science fiction, but again, and so electricity, right, is this amazing power source that we can create and generate all sorts of ways. And so that's where we are today, right, with this panel. And I apologize to all of you. We can't compete with the beach. It's 100 degrees out there. And for those of you who don't know, Vienna has the most amazing river beaches, right? And people that go by the thousands. and they're all out there, and we tried to get him here. It just didn't work. But anyway, this topic is so relevant, and it wouldn't be that relevant if Europe had its act together. And you know, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. The Europeans are in a funk about this whole subject. You know, in the US, they're very pragmatic, right? They say, oh, we don't have enough, we'll just make it happen with something. We'll either use coal to generate it, you know, or we'll go to space. There's very little ideological problem. And I think the Asians are pretty much also on track. Africa, I never know what's happening there, right? That's a more difficult place. But Europe, the second most important economy in the world, is really at a loss on what to do about this. And I know much less about it than all of you. And so I look forward to hearing if we can keep the lights on. I mean, I'm really looking forward to this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Zoltan, for your welcoming remarks. So in just a short moment, I will give the floor to Mr. Antonio Vayá. He's one of our speakers tonight, and to give us some opening remarks before we dive into the panel discussion, which will set a bit the scene. However, before I do that, let me just introduce you the 5 scenarios that I've mentioned before, so that we will have them in our mind while we dive in the panel discussion. So we have scenario 1, which is deal with Russia again. Europe quietly reopens the tab, cheap energy returns, but at what geopolitical costs? Scenario 2, Europe goes nuclear. A new generation of reactors, small model reactors, and a lifetime extensions come into play. Can the continent rebuild the expertise and political will in time? Scenario 3, renewables save us. Solar, wind, storage, and grid scale fast enough. What has to go right for this transition to succeed? Scenario 4, pay America. Europe locks in long-term qualified natural gas contracts and live with permanently higher industrial energy prices. Who wins and who loses? Scenario 5, do nothing or move too slowly. Europe muddles through. What does an energy stagnant Europe look like in 2035? Now, before I give you the floor, Antonio, let me just briefly introduce you. Antonio is from Spain, and he's manager at TerraPraxis. Antonio advises major energy users on nuclear development strategies and investment decisions, and works on advancing innovation approaches to scaling nuclear energy more efficiently and cost-effectively. Prior to this, he spent 6 years at the OECD Nuclear Energy Agency, focusing on nuclear development strategies and economic analysis for member countries. He also previously worked as the lead project engineer at Framatome. Thank you so much, Antonio, for being here. I will give you the floor now for your opening remarks. Thank you. By the way, you don't have to stand. You can also sit, whatever you like.
I think I'm going to stand.
Like a little showman.
No, I move a lot. Okay. So first, thank you to Eleonora for the introduction and to the Vienna Institute for the opportunity. So I'm going to move the slides, I believe. Perfect. So just before starting, few words about TerraPraxis. So I have, let's say, 2 companies, the for-profit and the non-profit, okay? So in the for-profit, I advise, and in the non-profit, I advocate, right? So the idea is, as TerraPraxis, we really believe that universal access to clean, scalable, and reliable energy is possible, but really the problem is the process. The technologies are there. It's just about bringing delivery models to do it at scale. And this is our, let's say, advocacy point, is really bring all this process innovation that is overlooked everywhere and bring it to technologies like nuclear. And we have an initiative which is Repower, in which we use these principles, conceptualize this to use existing coal sites and to put nuclear power plants. They're reusing the existing infrastructure. So that's all I'm going to say about that initiative. If you have questions, we can talk later. But right now, what I want to share with you is a little bit of, I would say this is my opinion, my vision on trying to answer this question, okay? So to do this, I just put the hat of the consultant, and we try just to break it down into something that is workable and bring some clarity. So the first thing I did is, let's just inverse the question and try to say, okay, this question is quite ambiguous. Let's say just, what must Europe do to keep the lights on? Okay. And as soon as we inverse it, when you say, okay, if I know what we have to do, then if we don't do it, we have the lights out, right? So this is the first step. And then this is the framework. So I try to break it down in 5 steps. So for me, what works very well is this gap analysis. And I think we're going to discuss today here is just where we are today. What are the challenges? And then let's say, okay, and what is the Europe that we want? And this is quite important because this is something we advocate at TerraPraxis is we take always a designer mindset and we let requirements to drive decisions. And this is there is a very nice speech from Steve Jobs telling you this, that the good way to do a nice product is you start from the customer and you figure out the product, not putting some engineers, have a fancy technology, and then try to where I sell it, okay? So let's take the requirements, the Europe that we want, drive the technology's decision. And I'm going to test it. I'm going to say, okay, these are the Europe I want. I test the technology, and then if I see gaps, then we start working and do a roadmap, right? So this a little bit of the steps. So let's start with the challenges. Of course, I'm going to be a little bit, let's say, I have some hypotheses already. As a consultant, I always say, okay, this is my hypothesis, and then I test it, do an analysis, and bring some facts, and I'm trying to solve it. So my hypothesis is that in Europe, we are slow, energy is expensive, and we don't have resources. So let's try to test it a little bit. So the first thing I did for the slowness is not obvious, but I just try to say, okay, I forget about clean, and I just think about firm capacity 24/7, even if it's coal, even if it's gas, how much do we bring every year? And when you compare this with what China adds to what Europe adds, is a factor of 5. Even the US does more. So there's something, maybe, I don't know, a process, something is not functioning, maybe. Then about the resources, I think it's quite obvious. I mean, the gas is mostly imported, and then if we move to this, let's say, low carbon, renewables, critical mineral-based economy, this gets worse because everything comes from, or I would say China. 95% of the critical minerals would be imported here. And then this is quite obvious. I mean, the prices, but the retail, the final, not the production cost. Now, when you add the transport and the taxes, the prices in Europe, in average, are just double as in the US. And this is mostly because the US has cheap and abundant gas, basically. And if you're an investor, what would you do? And you consume a lot of energy, would you come to a country that the cost is just double? I mean, maybe. It's just a question. We can discuss. And then I did this about the economy. Of course, GDP is a metric, has its shortcomings, doesn't measure everything, right? And I believe that in Europe we have things that cannot be captured in the GDP, really. But the reality is 20 years ago, the GDP in the EU was same, a little bit higher than the US, And in 20 years, they have doubled. And we just have increased 20%. Okay, this is a fact. And then is when I have the other situation, which is the reliability, and I was discussing with Jessica. Do you remember the number I say, okay, this is the firm capacity that we add every year in Europe, the rate. Now, it was gross capacity. Now you just subtract what we retire every year, the net, and it's negative. In fact, we retire more than we add. Also in the US, especially in the US, is coal. And in China, we don't get negative. Of course, it's coal what they are adding, and renewables. But okay, this may be an indication of something. And then when you see to the events, and this is a fact, and let's be clear, having a blackout, I mean, is very difficult, okay? The way the grid is operated, there are many rules and steps, things that as a grid operator you can do before you have a full blackout and a zero in your grid, like happened in Spain. There are things. You can disconnect part of the country, you know? And this is what some countries do every day. I mean, sometimes, but it's called load shedding, and you can do it. So when you look into these events, what is interesting in the US is that most of these events, and I don't know if you recall what happened in Texas, there was a storm, the gas pipelines froze. That was a storm, a weather event, and they cut 20% of the capacity, and they deal with that, but ERCOT, the grid, which is in fact a little bit isolated, that grid in the US, Texas, withstand. But what happened in Spain was they saw the zero the operator just saw zero, which is quite okay. How you reach that without just doing something? When you look into the events in Europe, some of them are weather dependent, but others are more about operational. So this is something we should be careful, of course. And we can discuss. I think the Spanish blackout was quite exception. I mean, a lot of failures, a perfect storm, okay? Really. But yeah, these are signals of something that maybe could get worse. And then, okay, let's go to the Europe that we want, or let's say the kind of technologies that we want. I think everybody should agree with these adjectives. I think we want clean energy, dense, which means in a small footprint, a lot of energy, that we can deploy fast, that is cheap, scalable. Proven means that, okay, it's already there. Firm dispatchable, that you can adjust, is flexible. And then, and Devora, you like this, sovereignty. Depends, there are stakeholders will, depending who you talk, we can understand different things about sovereignty. But for me, it's about controlling the value chain of this product. It's like I have some control. The pieces, the fuel, whatever. Would be great if I have this magic box. And then, because it's a magic box, in fact, I mean, then you take these requirements, and then you test all the technologies that you have. And I put firm capacity. Firm is like, okay, 24/7, on demand, whatever I want. And I put 3 options for nuclear, because people sometimes put everything under the same basket and say, nuclear is expensive. Wait a second. True, it's expensive, but what about the existing fleet? That is not so expensive, right? So part of my work when I was at the OECD was also trying to say to the people, don't put everything in the same basket, especially policymakers. But there is also enhanced geothermal, gas plus CCS, and then renewables plus storage. Well, did solar and batteries work well for 4 hours? Maybe 10 hours storage, more, it becomes expensive. But the bottom line here is very simple. There is no magic box. There is no technology that does everything. So if you are in a challenging situation, why would you rule out an option, right? So for me, the so what here is back a portfolio, play with everything, because you need, if you want to meet these requirements. And then, well, I think what is broken, what is dysfunctional, for my hypothesis is that is the process. In the previous slide, I put everything like a little bit of proven, because we have demos of first of a kind. I mean, the hard science for me, and we can discuss, is still in the fusion. There that you have challenges of really hard science stuff. But even for nuclear and SMRs, if you go back to the 50s, many of this stuff was already tested, in fact. So it's not so, I would say it's proven in that sense. What is not proven maybe is the process of scaling something, right? And if you just compare how long it takes to build a nuclear reactor in Europe compared to China, I mean, the numbers just are far lower. So there is something in the delivery process there. Or the times that get to just build transmission lines. I mean, the number of the grid that is added every year per million people in China is just insane. I'm not saying we should become a dictatorship, right? But this comparison is just about maybe there is something in between where you can just do this process better, or maybe regulate in a different way in which you keep, because an economy is like this, you have externalities and you need to regulate them. That I'm not, but maybe there is a way to do it maybe faster if you have a mandate of progress. So this is really, I think the process is something we are overlooking. So the idea right now is, okay, let's come back to the scenarios and let's say what we can do here. So the framework is really about, there are things that you can do in the short term and some things in the long term, and then of course you have technology options, but then you have the process, really. And I think this is where things can get improved. About the scenarios, I recall them again, deal with Russia, pay America, the gas part of the story, do nothing, and then we have more the long term, or Europe goes nuclear and renewables save us. I mean, then do nothing is clear. If we do nothing, I believe things get worse. Then what can we do in the short term? I think it's going to be gas, renewables, and extending the existing fleet of nuclear power plants. We are going to pay America, maybe. I mean, we are going to do it. I don't think we are going to pay Russia. But even if you pay America, I was thinking a little bit, I think we have also, I mean, assuming that the Hormuz Strait is open, we can procure for Qatar also LNG or other countries. So, and I think in Europe we are very good at making markets and competition. So I think this could be handled, the premium could be handled and procure, let's say, competitive LNG. I think it's not difficult. But then it's about the long term is when I would say we keep the fleet of nuclear because, and we can discuss later, they can run until 80 years. At least this is what is being decided in the US. But then it's about what happens with storage. Is really that, in my opinion, is if storage gets cheap and we solve the long-term storage equation, I think we can integrate renewables and then renewables save us. But if not, I think you need the firm capacity, and then is when you hedge against that risk with nuclear or CCS if you have pipelines and CCS storage, or deep geothermal if you have the resources. And really things are happening in the US regarding geothermal. Is quite interesting to follow. And then it's about the process, and Devora, we had a discussion, and I think there is a lot to do about collaboration also, about streamlining, about rethinking, but I really I mean, I do believe it's easier to say than to do. But maybe I think we have situations in which there's some sort of the COVID, the Ukraine war have shown that we can do things faster, right? So, but the idea, just for takeaways and a final message, and I start the debate because I think it's more important than what it's going to be quite interesting. The first message is that the challenges are real, don't overlook them. Take a requirements-first approach. Don't just choose a technology because you like it. Just think, this is the Europe that we want, and let those requirements drive the energy planning and the policy. I think the process, if you fix the process, the delivery part, the regulatory part, the permitting part, the siting part, you are solving a lot of the problem in Europe. And then the last thing is, there's so much uncertainty. I showed that there is not magic box, so just combine everything as much as you can. Use renewables and build nuclear CCS just for the long term, because this is what is going to help you to cope with this uncertainty. And again, I want to finish some sort of optimistic. Let's say that we in Europe we have the resources, we have the talent, we are very good at making policies, and so it's a choice, really. Yeah? So let's make the right choice, that start working on this. So this is my vision, so let's go to debate. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Antonio, for that. That was really great for setting up the scene for our panel discussion. So let me take a seat. So we are very fortunate today because we have like an outstanding panel, and that really represent different sectors and expertise. So I'm very looking forward for this. And Antonio, I've already introduced you, so let me allow me to introduce the other speakers that we have with us tonight. So we have Ms. Jessica Johnson, and she is Communications and Advocacy Director at nucleareurope, where she leads internal and external communication strategies and engages with key European stakeholders, including the European Parliament. Her work focuses on major policy areas such as the multi-annual financial framework and sustainable finance, and she's also responsible for initiatives related to skills development, workforce challenges, and attractiveness within the nuclear sector. Prior to joining the Nuclear Europe, she worked in communications for the European Cement Industry Association at EU level. Thank you so much, Jessica, for being with us tonight. Let me move on to the last two speakers we have. So Mrs. Devora Mazen, hi. She is co-founder and strategic capital lead of Acadia Dream, sorry. Devora works at the intersection of capital, infrastructure, and emerging technologies, with a particular focus on AI-driven data centers, energy infrastructure, and strategic investment. Over the past decade, she has worked extensively across venture capital, fundraising, and institutional investment platforms in the US, Europe, and Israel. Throughout her work, she focuses on how energy availability, capital flows, and infrastructure execution are reshaping global competitiveness and the next generation of strategic investment. Last but not least, we are delighted to welcome David Terblanche. He is co-founder and director at ScarabTech. David is a clean tech entrepreneur and strategy consultant with more than 2 decades of experience across Africa's informal markets. His work bridges a practical and grassroots perspective to questions of energy access, resilience, and systemic uncertainty. At ScarabTech, he is developing decentralized plastic-to-energy technologies designed to off-grid and resource-constrained environments where conventional energy solutions are often unavailable. Thank you to all our panelists for being here, and yes, for our discussion tonight. Now, to break the ice a little bit, I will ask one question to the panelists. It's a broad framing question so that the panelists are able to shine through perhaps their expertise in this panel discussion. So my question to you is, what is the biggest threat to Europe's energy future? And anyone can start as you go. Of course, Jessica, thank you so much. Please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to participate this evening. I think there is no one single threat to Europe's energy future. I think there are multiple threats. Clearly, security of supply, that has become a major issue in recent years, given the energy crisis, or should I say energy crises. So where is our energy coming from? Is it going to be cut off? And also, what is the cost of that energy? And I think that's the second challenge that Europe's facing, and that's the affordability challenge. So how much does that energy cost? Can our citizens afford it? Can our businesses afford it? That links to the third challenge, and that's the competitiveness challenge. So energy, particularly for energy-intensive industries, energy costs are 40+% of their manufacturing costs. And so the higher the cost of energy, the more that's eroding their competitiveness. But then we still have that big issue around climate change and decarbonization. I mean, let's be quite honest. Anyone who's been outside today cannot deny that our climate is changing in Europe, and we're seeing the effects of it. It's no longer climate change affecting other parts of the world. It's affecting Europe as well. Here we have heat waves. I'm originally from the Canary Islands, and we've never had as much, I mean, it's been decades since we've seen the amount of water we've had there. In fact, they've had so many storms in the last 9 months that they actually ran out of names for all of them. So decarbonization as well remains a really important challenge that Europe still needs to deal with. And this is why the conversation today is really focusing around strengthening or supporting homegrown clean energy sources. And that's why the discussion is about renewables and nuclear, because they are really seen as potentially the way to solve all these different challenges if it is done in the right way, if industry does things properly, if policymakers put the right policies in place, and if the investors are there to back the investments.
Hi, Devora Mason. Thank you to the VIGS team and to Eleanor for having us. Great to be here. I'm going to be the capital voice here, and I'm going to say that the threat in my industry, in my place where I'm sitting at the table, is quite clear. European industry is paying roughly double what the US is paying for industrial power, okay? And so they're also paying 50% more than China. So that is not just an energy line item anymore. What we're talking about is an economic sovereignty problem, because the gap in pricing is what is deciding, it's speaking for the AI compute and advanced manufacturing where it's going to be built, okay? In 2024, Europe took only 15% of the world's data center electricity demand, and the US took 45%. That's a third of what the US is taking, okay? So Europe is way behind. We're talking about US having 3 times more, and the gap is just widening, it's not closing. So the real risk isn't if the lights will go out, it's that the lights will stay on, but then the most valuable, energy-hungry industries will speak with their feet and get up and move elsewhere and open up their locations, their strategies, and the capital is already voting with its feet, and we need to resolve that as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thanks. I've got a mic there. Thank you. So, yeah, I mean, look, I come from a slightly different perspective. I come from a place where one could say the lights did actually go out. So before I get to Europe, I maybe want to kind of set the scene of what that looks like. And imagine it's a Thursday evening like this. You're sitting with your family, 7 p.m., you're having dinner, and halfway through your meal, the lights go out. And that's not because there's a power cut or a storm or any dramatic weather incident. This has been scheduled. It's planned, and it's going to go out again at 2 a.m. and 10 a.m. the next morning and the following evening. And South Africa lived for a period of 3 years of rolling blackouts, which was not due to any kind of grid actual failure, but due to a capacity issue, that there was not enough to go around, so it had to be rationed amongst the country. And that's the load shedding that you referred to earlier. And it was so pervasive that it was published in advance. There was even an app that tracked, so you knew down to the minute when your power would cut out. And the interesting thing is that the response to it didn't come from the government. The response came from civil society, from private individuals, from business, and it was quite remarkable, and I'll get into that a bit later, what people did, but they took it into their own hands to generate power because the government wasn't providing it. So the perspective I take as to what's the biggest threat to Europe is that scenario 5 you were talking about of doing nothing, is the erosion comes over decades. The decisions we make now, just because the lights are on now, doesn't mean that the decisions we make now are not important. If one doesn't make a 10-year planned decision, you're going to come up to a place like South Africa did, where there was corruption, poor planning, and eventually just ran out of runway. And when you run out of runway, the power goes out. So I guess that's the biggest threat, I would say, at the moment, is that these choices made across decades, and if there's inaction and the priorities go to the wrong places in terms of funding, then we're going to see a problem. Yeah.
Perfect. Antonio, do you want to say something very brief? You don't have to. I think
I already said the main challenges. So,
exactly.
Yes. Systemic threats, and I completely agree with this competitiveness issue that I think is going to be quite important, especially when you have right now this AI demand boost. Just very briefly, energy in this, if I link it to the data centers, for example, and you take this value chain of data centers, of course you have the energy, but then you have the compute, then you have the LLMs, the infrastructure. The energy is only 10% of the value.
It's even lower, it's 7%.
It's 7%. So
7% of the operating cost of the data center is going to energy.
the value is in having sovereignty over those data centers.
And sovereignty is a capital plan. It's not just a plan. Otherwise, it's a wish list. You need to have capital in place.
So just how important is to attract, and maybe this cost of electricity. I think there was a case of in UK also. I talk about Europe, broadly, and not only the EU. But yes, if you see some capital not flowing, it starts to be, and now we have this money is not coming here, it means that it's not reinvested in Europe, and then you start running into a spiral of this GDP just, the bridge gets bigger and bigger. I think this is something we can discuss more.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that warm-up. We have heard some key terms here, which we'll hope to hear again throughout: data centers and, the sovereignty, blackouts, and also homegrown clean energy. So all very interesting topics, which we hope we get more into it throughout our discussion. So if you don't mind, Jessica, we'll start with you. One, of course, of the scenarios that we have is, deal with Russia again. And the reason why I want to start with that is that I want to have, of course, everyone is talking about Russia and the conflicts that we have at the moment and the European role in such a conflict, and of course, it's energy. I want to ask the question of, what happens when the conflict ends, and should we revert to Russia? And this is more of like an introduction also for you to have a space into digging into the nuclear, of course, area. So please, Jessica, you're free to tackle this question however you want. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, when it comes to nuclear, there has been this conversation around Europe's dependence on Russian fuel, to some extent components, and radioisotopes, there's that element as well. And the EU has what is known as the Repower EU initiative, and part of that will be the nuclear proposal that is due hopefully by the end of this year. what we're basically saying, so we fully agree, we need to become more self-sufficient. So we need to ramp up enrichment and conversion capacity in the EU, because obviously shifting our dependence to another country doesn't necessarily solve the problem. The question is, how do you do that? Europe needs to put the right policies in place. So first of all, it needs to be very clear that the phase out of Russian fuel imports is a permanent phase out. So it's not a temporary one for as long as the situation remains or the war of aggression continues, but is one that will be, we never revert back to the current status quo, because if that doesn't happen, then the investors are simply not going to invest in the manufacturing capacity in Europe. Because at the end of the day, when you're investing in an enrichment and a conversion site, that investment is going to be in place for 60, 80, 100 years. And so if there's a risk in 2 years' time that, well, actually, no, we're going to go back to what we were doing before, obviously no one's going to invest on that. The second issue is obviously the policies. I mean, they need to have clear policies in place to say that nuclear has a future in Europe. And that links also to finance. So the EU needs to be willing to put money on the table to support such investments. I mean, we're not calling for the EU to pay for them, for these facilities, but just having access to a small amount of money is sending a signal to private investors, and they then are going to invest in the enrichment and conversion sites in Europe. So, yeah, it's really about making sure that we're sending the right message, that we're committed in the long term, and that we don't leave the door open to reverting back to imports.
Thank you, Jessica. Absolutely. I agree on you on so many points, so thank you for that. So let me just bring in Antonio here, since we're in the topic. And I would like to ask you, can you talk a little bit about the existing nuclear power and long-term operation, and is it affordable? And after that, I will come back to you, Jessica, as well. But if you can just jump in on that, perhaps.
No, because, okay, I love this topic.
I'm so glad.
But the existing fleet for me was very, very hard, because I know nuclear from the inside, and I know the numbers, and I understand what people say is expensive, because a new nuclear plant is expensive, a new one. But there is a misconception of the existing fleet, really, that people think that is just dangerous and not safe. And I mean, the facts are the following. If you go to the US, 95% of the fleet has the regulatory approval, 95% to operate until 60 years. The average age is 35. And there is 50% of the units that have approval for 80. So you see how long this could operate, right? There are many things that can be replaced in a nuclear power plant, except the vessel and the containment. But the rest of the things can be replaced. The people, the safety get better. And when you have the approval, it's already safe. If not safe, there's no approval and we shut down. As simple as that. It's not about. So you think to imagine you have an asset that is largely amortized. I mean, not largely, completely almost. And it's operating, and I know the cost is just, depends of every plant, because every plant has its own investment history, blah, blah, blah. But I can tell you between $30 and $40, $45 per megawatt hour is the price of existing fleet. Then, of course, you can add taxes to that and create an artificial burden. Of course, in the US, the gas was so cheap that some of these plants were closing for pure economic reasons, because they couldn't compete against the cheap gas there. But this has been reversed. But again, right now, with the demand that we have, you have a low carbon dispatchable for $45 megawatt hour, I think, when hyperscalers, so you see some PPAs for restarting an existing, I mean, you know, in the US, they close 3 Mile Island 1, and now they are restarting it. And the price that they are paying is over 45. I can tell you that. So, yeah, it's just to understand that I think it's a strategic mistake to close something that took so long to build, and with an increasing demand, and I think some countries are saying it have changed, and really, just when someone comes to you and tells you, nuclear is cheap, say, well, but what about the existing fleet? Because that is not so expensive. It's quite affordable, in fact. And we know how to do it. So that's my take on that, because I really get very vocal with this, not because of the Spanish situation, of course, but it's really cheap, and and we have an increasing demand. I don't understand why we should do that, as long as it's safe, right? And it's the case when you have a regulatory approval. So just keep on operating. That's mine.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting topic. We often associate this nuclear energy with some, horrible stories that we've heard in the past, and I think Jessica can tell us a little bit about that as well. But Antonio, you raised out a good point. I mean, investments and the demand, and I'm going to go back to Jessica on this point, because we are talking about investment, and the investment needs are huge. And so, what does that mean for nuclear? So, if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, I mean, the point was made about extending the life of existing fleet for as long as is technically and economically viable, and clearly that has been demonstrated is the cheapest form of electricity production in Europe today. When it comes to new build, yes, we don't have a great track record in Europe. The recent projects have been very expensive. They've taken way longer to build than they should have done. And so the industry needs to learn a lot of lessons, and it needs to implement those lessons. But we also have to take into account, it's very interesting, because the rollout of nuclear in the 70s and 80s was triggered by an oil crisis. And so there was this massive rollout, particularly in France and in the UK, but also in other European countries. However, after that, very little nuclear new build actually took place. You mentioned obviously the changing environment as a result of, for example, Chernobyl, and then more recently Fukushima. But what actually happened was, because these projects were not being rolled out as in the past, we lost the supply chain, we lost the skilled workforce, and now we're essentially having to rebuild all of that. And that is going to take time. There's also the investment side. We do see a lot of investors that are interested in nuclear, but again, it's coming back to that certainty aspect, because they need, and I think this applies to renewables as well, investors want to see a long-term stable vision for the future. So they want to know that what they're investing in today, the assets that they're investing in today, are there for the long run, and they're going to have a return on their investment. In this respect, for nuclear, access to capital is key. There's always this misconception that nuclear is only built with state aid. That's not the case. You have the projects in Finland, which is run on the Mankala model, and the Mankala model is no state intervention. It's basically private investment. And so private investment is key, and the cost of that private investment can be huge, because nuclear projects have very high upfront costs. They run for 80 years, or maybe more, in terms of new technology, but the initial cost is very high, and the cost of investment, so the interest rate that you're going to have to pay back, can really affect the cost of that project. And so what we need to see is policymakers going out there and saying, nuclear is part of our future energy system. So you're sending that certainty to investors to say it is part of the future. We're not going to cancel these projects every 4 years when governments change. But secondly, also providing them with access to finance, such as EU funds. We mentioned, I'm dealing with the multi-annual financial framework. That's going to be key, because it's going to provide some kind of de-risking mechanisms for nuclear projects, which again is going to stimulate that private investment. And the more private investment is available, probably the lower the rate of returns.
Thank you. Devora,
Antonio and I had a chance to have breakfast together today, so we solved a lot of problems over breakfast.
Thank you, Devora, for jumping in. I wanted to give you the floor exactly in this moment.
I want this also to be a discussion with Antonio, because there were a few things we talked about. We talked about the overlap of capital. Yes, investors are going to come in and invest in nuclear, but it's the same capital that's competing for the data center investments, and those investments are today and they're happening now. The returns are very, very immediate in that regard, and the ability to have a long-term client or PPA on these land deals is quite real. And so, yes, nuclear is the right technology, but the wrong timeline, I would say. And the data center capital is looking at those same deals and saying, what can I get today and tomorrow? Furthermore, I do think that what is also lacking is not necessarily private capital alone. We're looking at the strategy in the U.S. where federal funding comes in to play a part to encourage collaboration between states. And so you don't have overlap of viable energy projects happening a few kilometers away simply because it's over a state border, which we're seeing here in the EU. So there's overlap of building projects, energy projects, and resources that are happening not in the most efficient place in terms of capital, but in terms of who has decided to build that out now, who has the funding, and there's no collaboration cross-border. And so this collaborative effort is part of what we're going to be looking at in the European, for the European Union to take as part of their energy sovereignty plan, to also make it clear that there needs to be that collaborative effort being made for the projects being built across the states and working together as one unit to build out the plan and create the energy solutions.
Please, Antonio.
No, I want to jump in on the policy, so if certainty, but if in the US, regarding nuclear, we have bipartisan. Right now, both parties, Republicans and Democrats, are aligned on nuclear. So you are pretty sure that this is not going to change. So you have the policy signal that Jessica was mentioning. And then I really like the timeline mismatch, because this is really what ends up in this. It's like the risk profile of nuclear is just not acceptable for industrial because of the timeline is not aligned. And the only thing, so the hyperscalers that they are securing right now is gas, and even that is a little bit complicated because the turbines are, the supply chain, the waiting time of the turbine is increasing. Before, let's say this AI boom was maybe 2-3 years and now it's just 5-7, so it's already blocked. But also the deals that are happening, as I said, that are relatively fast, if you want to power a data center, is gas, or you take existing nuclear power plants and trying to just pass a PPA with or do and I really like this, what is called the power up rate. Okay, you can increase power a little bit in a nuclear power plant up to 20%. Nuclear power plants have been uprated, but there is still some margin. So there are still in the US, there are some numbers running. I've done estimates, and it's around 10 gigawatts, 15 gigawatts you could extract from the existing fleet just having a power up rate. So you just pass a PPA and these people invest and you can have it in less than 5 years. And I was, go ahead.
Antonio, remember, one of the things we discussed as well is there's the short term and there's the long term. Yeah. And then what happens between the short term and the long term, right? So that's where the planning comes in. The European Union is great at regulation. They're leaders together with China in climate regulation. There's definitely a body, a governmental or I would say a regulatory body in place that wants to see those things happen. So we can look for the short-term solutions right now. We think everyone is looking for that. We're all discussing that. Nuclear could be a long-term solution, of course. What happens between those two stages, the short and the long term? And we're talking about timelines of between 5 years till 25, 30 years. So, yeah.
So, I mean, this is public. I take the example of Google. For example, they don't only bet on nuclear, okay? They have a gas plus CCS project taking place. They also have enhanced geothermal projects. So they just tried. For me, I would say they are hedging a little bit. They are just putting some money in projects and see if because they have the pockets are so deep in these companies. I mean, when I say deep, is their annual capex could be of one single company is between 50, to 100 billion, say, one single company. So if they just put 300 million on something, this is maybe less than 1% of their annual capex. Their exposure to risk is nothing, and maybe they can move the needle and accelerate. So I think of course you need a policy planning, but I think these companies are taking some action, and they have really, I would say, the resources to shape things.
We also discussed the deal happening in Texas, which is essentially it's Chevron, right? And they are building an behind-the-grid sort of solution for the energy. They're still relying on the grid, though, and that solution essentially will take some of that energy off of the grid, but they're still going to be relying on the grid. They're still going to need the energy from the grid. So that's an example where huge amounts of capital we're able to try out a solution that works for them. The capital is not the issue, and I don't think in Europe the capital is the issue either. I mean, we've seen some of the deals happening. We're always amazed by the size of the deals. Capital's there. We just want to keep bringing it back to the table, bringing it back in and offering opportunities. So those types of deals, big deals happening in the US, we want to create those deals as well in Europe if we want to see Europe taking a lead.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned earlier the Finnish model, which is the Mankala model, which is a very interesting one. I don't know, I'm sort of looking around the room to see if anyone knows what the Mankala model actually is. I don't see any nodding heads, so maybe I'll just quickly explain it. Basically, it was the paper industry that invested in the Olkiluoto 3 power plant. And now that it's connected to the grid and producing electricity, they're receiving that electricity in return for their manufacturing process, and what they don't use, they then sell to the grid. So yes, it was a very expensive project, and it was very, very delayed, but today the paper industry is delighted in Finland, to be honest with you. And that is a model that could work really well when it comes to, for example, data centers and small modular reactors. And that's what we're seeing happening in the US. You're seeing the GAFAMs signing contracts with SMR developers, because ultimately you can have your data center and you can build your small modular reactor next to it. It can then provide the electricity that the data center needs 24/7, because that's one of the issues with the renewables. They're not available 24/7, and I don't think any data center is going to be able to operate in a stop-start mode, to be honest with you. And so they could invest in the small modular reactor and get that electricity in return. And that would solve a second issue, because the GAFAMs can pay the price for high price for electricity. So they could end up bidding other industries out of the market, because they're able to pay more for the electricity. So the less electricity available, the more expensive it becomes. And they would be able to buy that electricity from the grid, potentially, rendering other industries, making it impossible for them to operate anymore. And so if you're able to have a system that you have GAFAMs investing in SMRs and getting the electricity in reserve, that solves the second problem. So they're models that are very, very interesting. And Europe needs to be doing more to support such models. I mean, we're seeing it happening in the US. But we need to see it happening more and more in Europe, because at the end of the day, running a data center on gas doesn't solve the CO2 issue, unfortunately. And it doesn't solve the import issue either, because Europe does not have gas, or has very little gas available. So if you're going to run your data center on gas, you're not solving your energy security problem either. And this is where we do really see an avenue for SMRs and data centers working together.
Thank you very much. If there are no more comments, I will try to shift the conversation to renewables then. I think it bridges very well to what we've discussed. So we've touched upon, of course, the data center versus the nuclear competing on the same capital, and now supporting an energy system based on nuclear and renewables. So let's shine through David's expertise here. So I want to focus on David, and you've mentioned before that you come from a country that has actually experienced prolonged grid failure. Correct. And not as a scenario, but as a lived reality. So what does it actually cost an economy when the lights goes out?
Sure, it was quite dramatic. I mean, what you saw was the direct impacts on business, from big business to small business, is when you've got, I mean, I think in 2022, we had 205 days of load shedding out of the year. And by 2023, there were 335 days. So it's obviously rolling through the country, it's on and off, but that basically shows there were more days with interrupted power than there were stable days. And so the impact on that is that 85% of businesses were directly impacted. 40% of businesses turned around and said this had a major revenue impacts. I mean, your production goes down. So if you're a major operator, you can put in a solar system on your building. So, or you can put in a major generator. And what we found, though, is that the small and medium businesses couldn't. And they just lost so much production. They estimate, I think it was 650,000 jobs were lost in South Africa over the course of 3 years just because of the power cuts. I mean, we're talking about somewhere between 11 million and 50 million euros a day economic cost for there being no power. I mean, it's actually terrifying. So what you found is that the big businesses putting in a generator, say ShopRite Group, which is a major retailer, I think they spent 30 million euros in 6 months just on diesel to run their stores and keep the lights on so that they could operate their retail. Now that cost goes to a consumer, it pushes prices up, so there's a whole knock-on economic effect, which is, I mean, estimates go as high as 2% GDP damage just because of this. So the interesting thing is that there's an inequality in that. Just like the big businesses can survive because they've got the infrastructure to put power in and the small can't, the rich individuals have the ability to put solar in, put a generator in, and maybe more in the middle class, and the poor go back to burning anthracite coal or paraffin or wood just to keep heat and keep lights and to be able to do their homework. So the impact is very real, and this is a failed grid, and it's possible. But the exciting thing on the renewable side, though, is that over that same period, we saw 5 gigawatts of solar power being put in, solar rooftop power being put in an 18-month period. Now, let's put it in context of Austria. So in 2023, Austria had its biggest peak investment, and there was 2.6 gigawatts, I think, of solar energy that was created. It was a response to the Ukraine war, and that was its peak, and it's dipped since then. South Africa in that same year also created 2.6 gigawatts of solar, but with no governmental intervention. It was businesses putting it on their roofs, hospitals putting it on their roofs, car parks where the cars are covering the carports with solar panels. It was one of the biggest rollouts of private solar in the world in a short period of time, and it was completely funded by private individuals and by business. Now, that intervention, there's one caveat in that they opened up a license that said at one point anything above 1 megawatt you had to be registered with the energy regulator. But at that time, they said anything up to 100 megawatts. So basically, it just meant that a business could overnight just put in solar. So they were importing solar panels, importing batteries, and in 18 months, they created so much capacity that it almost eliminated the need for load shedding because the demand on the grid had dipped so much, along with some other stabilizing factors that were there. But the point is that the renewables can scale at that pace, but this is done on a decentralized basis. So you've got a rooftop solar with battery system for this building, and a rooftop in your house, and a rooftop in the hospital that is operating it. what happens then is, I think what is happening here in Europe, and that's a barrier, is that when you have big solar arrays out in the desert, or big wind farms also in these remote areas, is South Africa's grid was built for coal power plants and was very centralized. So now you've got all of these decentralized power plants that are coming in, and they're trying to plug into the grid, and there's a backlog and an inability to feed all of that power into the grid system. Now, I understand Europe is facing a similar backlog, and approval to plug into the grid is a problem. So I guess the point is that if you give people the freedom, renewables can move out of necessity. It can move that fast. But there are some structural problems that come when you try to do it at a centralized institutional level. And that's probably a grid conversation, which is about saying, yes, I can do renewables within a year or two, but can the grid keep up, which is maybe 10 years upgrade cycle to keep the grid in place?
Thank you, David. Antonio, I will allow you to jump in on this if you would like to, because of course, talking about grid failure now, you've mentioned in your presentation, you talked about the blackout. So, there's advanced systems that, become vulnerable, let's put it that way. And so what lessons can we draw from this?
And also, Jessica, I had a very interesting discussion with her, in Spanish, by the way. But I think the model that David described, it works, but it's when it has some limitations. It's just, renewables are so cheap, and solar is easy, so you can install it very short time. The problem is also, of course, is what happens when the sun is not shining. And I believe, I really like this case that you presented, and I'm going to do some research because it's fascinating. But I believe that this was a mix of solar, batteries, and diesel, yes, in some, because at some point you need that backup. And I want to come back to really that need of the backup, because that is a little bit the limitation, in fact, of this model. And okay, so if I bring it to the Spanish blackout, of course, I said I think it was a perfect storm event. The grid, it gets difficult to manage, I would say, when you have a lot of renewables, high shares of renewables injecting, and then low demand. And this happens particularly also in spring and summer, and it's about balance of supply and demand. So there are mechanisms too, but there are two parameters that you look into, is the frequency and also the voltage. So what they observed in Spain is that there were some events of the voltage was not at the level of it should be, but it was still manageable. But I think they were running really thin, and I have some reports, and I can show very, very thin on the let's say dispatchable capacity on the grid, because you still need that to provide like that inertia that we call to the system. And the problem of solar is still. You cannot provide that inertia. When I say the inertia, is that you need that to have that frequency, and this is provided in a passive way with these turbines just turning at a coal plant, right? Solar doesn't do that. There are some ways to do it in a synthetic way, is the grid forming technologies, but again, at scale, this has not been proven. And what happened in that event is, especially when you see where the first problems started to happen, there are maps showing how much film capacity there was by region. And the problems started to happen in those areas where there was a lot of solar and few film capacity. And they started to disconnect. They tried to do some work on that to stabilize, but at some point they cannot. And then the whole grid collapses. So I don't want to really blame the blackout on renewables, because I think it's more about mismanagement of, and this is my opinion of the grid operator, how it was operating with high shares of renewables. Because in Spain, there is not a lack of capacity. We have a lot of gas. We have, in fact, an overcapacity of gas. It's just they decided to run thin. Mm-hmm. It's just to run a Ferrari without brakes or something. And at some point, they have a crash. Mm-hmm. And they tested the system. They reached the limit. And what happened next? And it's very interesting. After the blackout, magically, they start to operate in the reinforced mode. And what they do, you start to see that gas, they start to activate more gas allow more. You can see around 2 gigawatts more now after the blackout. As an average, they have more plus 2 gigawatts still spinning, running, just in case. I don't know why they didn't do that before, but yeah. And you are seeing a lot of additional cost in what they call in Spanish restricciones técnicas, but in English is redispatching. It's when you, I mean, it's a little bit complex, but this is how it works on an electricity system. You do an economic dispatch, it's just, okay, let's say I decide who dispatch based on economics. But at some point you have the physics. And in very short time, you have to decide if someone enters just to balance the system. You can see that those costs of, in a very short term, in an hour, can you connect this just to balance the system are increasing a lot. And this is about just paying someone in the short term, pay a gas plan just to run, to balance the grid. And those costs have increased a little bit. I mean, not a little bit, I think several hundreds of millions since the blackout. So I think we are going to face this problem of this is going to hit a limit. You need to manage the grid differently when you have renewables. And I think the equation at some point, I think, is going to be the storage. To what extent this is going to be cheap at large scale. Of course, during 4 hours, you can store, you can have a lot of solar, you charge your batteries, and then at 7, when gas ramps, and I take the example of California, then you discharge, and you displace some fuel. But then, I mean, how many batteries do I need just to displace all this gas? So at some point, it's easier just to keep some firm capacity there and have batteries, but not this massive overbuild that if you do it only with renewables could be a massive cost. So I think I do believe about having this portfolio and having this and do an optimum. And I don't know what is the optimum in South Africa. But again, the optimum, I think, is renewables, and then you still have let's say, a bandwidth of baseload, and depending in each country, will be higher or lower. Those countries that have a lot of hydro, a lot of water, it's like a tap. It's just turn on, turn off. They can integrate renewables very easy, but those that don't have water, and I think Austria has a lot of water, hydro, I believe. So that helps.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Thank you, Antonio. Back to you.
It's not easy topic. Huh?
No, definitely. But I mean, we're not here for easy, no? So thank you, Antonio. I will pass back on David because, I wanted to touch upon again on the new renewables. So South Africa, of course, invested heavily on renewables and the grid continued to fail. And so what went wrong and what can Europe learn from this as well, from that experience? So maybe we can touch upon that. It flows very nicely to this other topic.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's what we touched on earlier about that speed of deployment and inaction. And I mean, it was years of decay. We had a lot of corruption, which definitely played a factor. And we had a bunch of stalled projects. I mean, we had nuclear plants that we've been talking about for 15 years that they're still talking about. And like nothing has moved. The money hasn't gone into it. The the engineers were there and the consultants were there. That money's been spent, but there was nothing delivered. So if they'd actually hit play 15 years ago, they wouldn't have had load shedding. So I think that in action is back to where we stand. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you, David, for that. Let me switch the topic. So we've touched upon, the Russia, the nuclear. Now we've also touched upon renewables. Let's move on to, the capital landscape. So the EU versus the US. Devora, I want to give you the floor. So my question to you is, you originate and structure these deals across both markets. So how different is the capital landscape for clean energy and infrastructure in Europe versus the US? And what can Europe realistically learn?
Well, for clean energy, let me just focus for a minute on the capital landscape in the U.S. I think that the regulation, the collaboration, and something we talked about, the capital on the ground is being, there's an encouragement there for AI-based projects to continue to open and expand there, as well as a lot of the energy-heavy industries are being encouraged to open their doors and to stay and to remain on the ground. And so the federal government has to, of course, play a part in incentivizing, creating the collaboration between the states, as I mentioned before. And those projects are going to continue to grow in scale. The large asset managers, wealth managers, the large investors are keeping their capital local for the most part. We find that on our platform, 85% of our deals are in the US. Although we have deals situated in Europe, what it boils down to in the end is the pricing, and the capital itself can invest. It has no limitation for space or time, but it is limited by the desire to have viable investment with a proper deployment, a proper tenant, a hyperscaler, whatever it might be. That capital is going to be used and going to be deployed, and it's going to be provide the returns for the investors that they're hoping for without the exorbitant costs of energy. So I think that is, the U.S. are the LNG developers. So for Europe, we're dealing with, in Europe, they're dealing with two issues. One is the actual purchase of 2/3 of the LNG from USA, but there's also the shipment. So all of those shipments of LNG are being done through Greek and Japanese shipment companies or ships and so on, fleets. And so Europe has to deal with both of those issues, meaning if they're not paying the prices that match the shipments, and the shipment's going to go elsewhere. And so they have to always be matching those prices. And we see that countries that can't afford, like India, are not getting the shipments and they're losing out on they're being rerouted to the places that can't pay. In the USA, they have the energy on the ground. They can implement it. And although I mentioned briefly the recent direct purchase of energy, so this was the Chevron deal, where there was a direct purchase, taking it out of the grid and making the energy going directly to the supplier, from the supplier, to the client. So we see that that's going to make a huge difference, and that's a model that can be done on the ground because of the access to the natural gas and to the LNG as well. The development there on the ground. I don't think Europe has that capability. We're importing. We're reliant on other people. Europe is reliant on the U.S. Import.
Thank you, Devora. Absolutely. So I will bring in David again onto this aspect. About tackling Europe's risk as dependency on an external power. So we mentioned the U.S. and then Russia. So is external dependency the only threat, or are you seeing something else?
I think the threat is clear, like in the South African example, that the threat can be internal, just by messing it up. And I think that there's got to be yeah, I think some of the sovereignty is making sure that you've got your planning in place.
Yeah, and on the sovereignty question, Devora, so we'll back to you on this. Like you frame sovereignty as, as a thread running through this whole debate. What does an energy sovereignty plan actually require, and how does it get funded?
I think the sovereignty plan will require a capital umbrella to begin with, so that's going to be a very important part of it. And in addition, it'll require the collaboration, so the cross-state collaboration, a short and a long-term plan, private capital, right, public capital as well, and an understanding from each state. The European Union is great at regulations, it's great at research. Very quickly, this needs to be established. Each state, what they're winning at and what they're losing at, and then applying that to an overall European strategy. I think that we were discussing earlier, some of the states, the European states have great achievements great assets, great capabilities, and other things that they're limited by, challenged by. As you mentioned, one of the things can be access to water. Another thing could be the cost of building, or the access to to the energy sources. So definitely those things need to become collaborative, and I think that the energy sovereignty project needs to look like that. Yeah.
Jessica, absolutely. I like how you already know when it's your time to come in, definitely. So my question, you're free to respond, but yeah, my general question would be like, so is EU policy heading in the right direction?
I'd say it's taking positive steps in the right direction. This notion, and I mentioned at the beginning, homegrown clean energy, that actually comes from Ursula von der Leyen. And 3 years ago, we would never have heard a Commission president say that. They would have been saying renewables, renewables. So it is definitely progress that is being made. Also because, it's not just about electricity. As mentioned earlier, I used to work in the cement industry. We need to have access to different energy sources. First of all, we need to electrify as much as possible because we can produce massive amounts of decarbonized electricity in Europe through nuclear and renewables. So electrify what you can electrify. That's electric vehicles, it's electrifying manufacturing processes if you can. But then we do also have some other alternatives. So you can use heat. The paper industry very often, their manufacturing process is based on heat. You can use heat from nuclear power plants, for example. You look at, for example, the Czech Republic. The local community, actually, their district heating system is powered by the heat coming from the nuclear power plants. So again, that's possible. And with the advent of small modular reactors, the heat aspect is going to become even more important, and then it can be used in chemicals, etc. The third one is the hydrogen point. So we can have a lot of conversations as to whether hydrogen really will be a solution in the future, but it is there, it is on the table, and again, you can produce massive amounts of hydrogen from decarbonized electricity produced by nuclear and renewables. And again, there's an economic model in there as well. We've looked at, if you're going to extend the life of existing nuclear power plant, and when you're doing the investment in LTO, so long-term operation, sites could potentially consider investing in a hydrogen electrolyzer at the same time. So they could build the electrolyzer next to that nuclear power plant that they're doing the upgrades on, subject to there being an industry close by that can use that hydrogen, because the big issue on the hydrogen is really the transport costs. It's logistically, it's challenging, it's expensive. So if you have an industry that can use the hydrogen close by, then that's a great economic model that can also help finance the long-term operation of the existing fleet. But coming back also to this capital, Europe is more risk adverse, I would say. We're less kind of that boom bust notion from the US. So I think there's also, it protects savers, it protects pension funds, so there's an element in there that's protecting citizens, I would say. But at the same time, we need to take politics out of decisions on investments. And I'll give you a clear example. We have the sustainable finance taxonomy. And essentially, according to sustainable finance taxonomy, investors now, banks, etc., have to report on what share of the investment is considered taxonomy compliant or not. So the goal is basically to push investors to only invest in sustainable technologies, which is fine if you based your taxonomy on science. Unfortunately, the taxonomy is partially based on ideology. And what we're seeing today, so nuclear, for example, is included under the taxonomy, but as a transitional technology. So the science is there, the Commission's scientific body, the Joint Research Centre, produced a fantastic 400-page report that says nuclear is as sustainable as renewables, but it is treated as transitional. As a result, sunset clauses are applied. So basically, the investments in the long-term operation of existing nuclear power plant can only be considered as taxonomy compliant so long as the license to extend that facility is granted by 2040. For new build projects, they have to receive the license by 2045. Beyond that, it will no longer be considered taxonomy compliant. And a lot of investors are telling us that the closer we get to 2045, the less likely they are to invest in nuclear because they're not going to be able to list that investment as sustainable anymore. And that can then impact on decisions that shareholders are making, etc. And so this is where, from an investment perspective, we need to focus on the science and we need to remove the ideology. Because that's the only way really that we can, again, guarantee that long-term perspective. Because with ideology, opinions change as governments change. With the science, it doesn't. It's long-term, and that's what investors need, that long-term vision.
Absolutely, very well put. Thank you, Jessica. So please, Antonio.
I just want to link with this sovereignty issue. I mean, something that can happen when you have a renewable heavy system is that then you are maybe changing the dependence to gas. I mean, I agree we need to electrify and displace, but maybe you have the critical minerals that you cannot control. And then the sovereignty is again impacted. And how you balance that, of course, you can diversify where you supply and try to play with that. But then I must say also from a technical perspective, and when you see the level of materials intensity by megawatt hour, okay, so also nuclear helps to, it's like a double, you displace gas and at the same time you don't have that exposure to the critical minerals. So it's also a lever, I would say. But I think also can be done not only relying on technology. I think you can have a procurement and supply strategy also to reduce that or increase that sovereignty of the control over the critical minerals too.
Thank you very much, Antonio, absolutely. If the panelists don't have anything more to add, I would like to just, please, David, I knew you would.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the one thing that all of these scenarios misses is what actually happens if the grid does go out and there is no power and there is no supply and it's broken. And I mean, and that's the interesting scenario. So I talked how quickly we rolled out solar in South Africa, and Antonio quite correctly pointed out that it can't just be solar, it needs some sort of generator backup. So the staggering amount of diesel that was used over that period to keep the lights on, even at a central power generation, they were running big diesel gen sets to keep things going when the coal power station was offline or the wind wasn't coming in. So what we found is you are using diesel, and that's what we've been trying to do on a decentralized basis. You've got decentralized solar, but now how do you get diesel in when the Strait of Hormuz is closed? You can't. So what we found is that everywhere you go, in every community, on every island, in big cities, small rural locations, you've got a glut of plastic that is locally found. And big plastic to energy plants don't really work in a context that you have to transport plastic maybe a couple hundred kilometers to keep this big thing fed. But on a small decentralized program, you can take localized plastic, local industrial plastic, take the waste from, say, a CNC factory and put that into a machine, make fuel from it, and then use that to run the power generator when the solar batteries die. So what you're creating is effectively, once you eliminate the carbon cost of end of life for that plastic, you're creating and eliminate the carbon cost of the well, the mining, to the to the transport, to the refinery, to the fuel tank. You eliminate that carbon cost, you end up with a carbon neutral localized fuel that is created locally and used locally. So this is the necessity, and I understand that this is where everyone's trying to move away from. It's moving away from the green, but in a time of actual crisis, people are going to go to where they know, and they're going to go to diesel. And you have to find a way to supply it. So it's just an interesting take that, you know, if we get it wrong and it does fall over, you know, this is the apocalypse machine, if you want to call it that. You've got to have off-grid decentralized facilities.
I mean, renewables are very good, and the way I describe them is because they are fuel savers. They displace fossil, but they don't add capacity, meaning they don't displace the diesel generator. That's the thing. It's just they are good to reduce, you don't burn as much fuel, but you still need to keep that diesel gen set there. So how you, and maybe the storage is the key. I mean, if you have the cheap storage, but even with that, you still keep the gen set. So that's why at some point is you need both. And the idea is, okay, when you have this firm capacity, you can have the undispatchable, you can accommodate that, let's say, homegrown or cheap, and then flex, and you don't have, you effectively, let's say, remove the genset. That's why that's the idea. Is what I've seen is that with renewables, you just consume less fuel, and this is important. You can decarbonize, of course, and very quick, but you still you don't displace the gas plant or you don't displace the genset. And this is what, is the backup. And that can be quite expensive at some point, and especially when you have these periods of, maybe not have them win, and so that's the limitation, I would say, and that's why I believe in an optimal mix, and again, it depends in every country, every region.
Thank you, Tonio. So I just would like to conclude this panel discussion with just one last question. So, of course, our title of the panel discussion is, when will the lights go out in Europe? And I want to spin it off with a bit more of a positive question. So, what will it take to keep Europe's lights on? So just a very, very brief comment, just to conclude your thoughts on this panel discussion. Then we'll move on to the Q&A questions if any of the audience has any questions for you. Thank you very much.
Okay. I don't think that what will keep them on is a single technology. In the end, it's bankable capital that meets firm power. And Europe doesn't lack money. You know, they don't lack speed, they don't lack structure, but the capital has to flow in the right direction to the right space. Europe is strong enough. I mean, we like to be dramatic, but Europe is strong enough and capable enough that I just don't see the lights going out anytime soon, unless we decide to turn them off ourselves and go to sleep. But overall, I think that Europe's real edge is patience, maybe a little bit too patient, and they lack a sense of urgency, but at the same time, the patience is a value, and they lead on standards and efficiency. So let's take that European patience, marry it to American velocity and risk, right? And then the lights will stay on, will attract the right industries to stay in Europe, and work with the industries that matter so that we can create a viable economy in the energy industry.
Technology neutral policy that's based on science rather than ideology, and massive investment in clean, homegrown energy sources.
Yeah, I mean, I think I painted the picture of if things go really badly, how one needs to do it. But I mean, I do agree. There's got to be a blend. And yeah, there's no one solution, but perhaps some of these things are, you talk about nuclear as an interim technology, but I mean, diesel is an interim technology. It's going to be 25 years before it's phased out. There has to be a cleaner source of it. And you've got so much stuff lying around, so there's an interim technology that solves an interim problem until we get rid of plastic, for example. So that's our kind of third world, take from a place where you can't rely on the European grid staying up. So you make another plan and you use what resources are locally available. So yeah, slightly nuanced perspective from the southern tip of Africa.
I'm going to be brief, but yes, just keep all the options open. I already said that. And if we can just regulate but make things faster, I don't know how in Europe, but if we just can make it faster, the permitting of some stuff, the licensing of some stuff, then maybe if the capital will say, okay, we have this umbrella that is Europe, but we like because it provides certainty, but and now we do it faster. And maybe there might be things about taxes somewhere, no? But yeah, let's see.
Thank you very much. So, as we can see, there's no simple solution, yeah? There's only trade-offs. And I'd like to open now the discussion to the audience. If anyone has any questions, please, Naomi, I will just give you my microphone, please.
Yeah, thank you. It was an amazing discussion. I mean, I have so many thoughts, but okay. So I bring in a different aspect, like the consumer, like the wannabe conscious consumer, energy consumer. I'm European. I'm going from the European perspective. So, what I hear or read or what's going on as collecting information, like what is good, what is bad, and what we heard first that coal is bad, and then nuclear is very bad. And then, gas, of course, gas is also bad. And then the solar panels, that's bad for the animals because they bump into it and they die. And then, of course, the wind ones, always against the birds. And then water, okay, we have to not use as much water when we clean our teeth because, so I mean, we learned that all of these things are bad. And I just wonder, so something is, I think it's very bad how it's like people get the information out of this. So now we are basically against all of these and we don't know I don't know how are other people, but that's what we see, that people are rebelling against all of these because different groups, because this is bad, that's bad, it's we don't know what's good. So how, I think there should be something like change of how I don't know, people get the information, or how to get better information for the consumers, because something now I think it's it's not the right way, and whose responsibility is that? So that's basically my question. So I feel it's very chaotic now, this situation. Yeah.
It's a very important point that you actually raised there because, yes, nuclear projects are being delayed, but so are renewables projects. I mean, one of the reasons why grids aren't being deployed massively, why renewable projects are struggling to get off the ground, is the public acceptance issue. The reality today is policymakers need to have an honest conversation with citizens. You want to have access to energy. You want to be able to charge your mobile phone. You want that energy to be affordable. You want to be able to heat your home. That means trade-offs. That means that you have to accept that there are grids that need to be built, that we do need to have renewables. We need solar panels where there's a lot of sun. We need wind farms where there's a lot of wind. We also need the other technologies such as nuclear, where there isn't the wind, there isn't the sun, or you do still need the backup at night, for example. And that's an honest conversation that policymakers need to have. And it's coming back to this point about ideology. We need to remove ideology from policy, and we need to have a science-based approach to all of this and communicate the science to citizens, because we can't afford to continue the direction we're going in, because otherwise our energy system is just going to collapse.
I guess part of the social responsibility, as you're talking about, also relates to the fear-mongering around many of these different processes. I think, we've seen lately in the US that citizens have been putting stops on data centers that are, land that is being designated for data center build because they feel it's going to affect the pricing of their energy, even though these prices have been hedged to, sometimes 2 or 3 years ahead of time. And it's not what's affecting the price of their own energy costs. And then data center is being built and everyone is up in arms, that it's, taking away their energy or affecting the environment. And yet at the same time, it's only 2% of industrial energy, global industrial energy that's actually going to data centers. And many of these centers are either, repurposed land or bringing value to the region by creating jobs and so on. And so that's, the manufacturing itself, is going to bring jobs. It's going to create value to the locals. It's not necessarily going to affect their energy costs because those prices have been decided ahead of time. And so, they started to put stops on it because they feel the need, like you said, to communicate with people and explain to them what's happening around them, what it looks like. I always find it ironic that now a big lobbyist in the U.S. has come out with a map of data centers in the U.S., but the map is land that could be designated. It's not only data centers. It's data centers that have been approved and might be built. And I always look at that map and I think, I think this map was AI generated, but that's my own cynicism when I look at the map. That I don't know how such a detailed map was created without AI. Okay, but let's just say for a second that it was created manually. I saw that she said in one of her articles that she had phone calls. People called her and updated her about, I don't know if I should mention him, but she's very famous lobbyist, Erin Brockovich, so, we know her from the movies and so on. But so everyone called her and updated her on all of the data centers in the map. It wasn't, AI created. Okay, maybe, I don't know. But we have to communicate. We do have to communicate. We have to let people know what's happening on the ground, what's happening around them, how it's going to affect them for good and for bad. It is a responsibility. It's a social responsibility. So it's not only about the type of energy per se, but it's also about being communicative and letting people know what's being built in their backyards.
I can't. Oh. I completely agree. I think there is something about showing the benefits of these things. When you start to feel the pain or some stuff, and I really like what happened in South Africa, they took action. So maybe, of course, it's about communication, but at some point, if you start to feel the pain of high electricity prices and maybe you see, okay, this is bad, but we have to do something. So you start to, maybe the social license is easier when you share the benefits that those projects could bring, either in the short term, long term, or to make them more resilient. And that's why, I think, and Devora, you said something also this morning that I like, which is this sense of urgency. And we didn't cover that. I think in South Africa there was urgency to act and they did it. So maybe in Europe, we need to create that because urgency is about also aligning people. Like, there are so many stakeholders, there are so many frictions there that, things get slow and expensive. But if you have this sense of urgency there, how you create, maybe you need a war, another war, I think we need to wake up, but I think also the benefits, the sense of urgency, the communication, these are three things that should help to make people change.
I just wanted to respond to the sense of urgency. So as I mentioned, European patience and regulation coupled with U.S. risk-taking and velocity, so to speak, and that's really important. But the sense of urgency, part of the communication is also understanding the need, the growing need. So for example, the 2% that I mentioned of global capacity is growing 12% a year. We don't know what the future looks like right now in terms of the growth. We know what it looks like today based on the projections for the future. But the sense of urgency is building out a strategy that will include all of the different elements of the energy infrastructure making sure that the pricing is viable, making sure that the capital is there on the ground, and then, of course, recognizing, and I'm going back to what we talked about before, the short-term versus the long-term goals, and having a bridge in between those, so that we're not stuck, without a solution. We see that also from, to build turbines and to build turbines today costs, way more than it did 20 years ago. But 20 years ago, we didn't plan for the amount of energy that we would need today, and so we didn't plan around that. So even communicating that to farmers, letting them decide also to use their land for the alternative energy, and to put turbines on their land. People don't like talking about, aside from the different types of energy, they don't like talking about using farmland. We're purists, and farmland is farmland. But at the same time, giving the farmers the option to use some of that land to put energy infrastructure there could also create a good economic model going forward.
Can I have a question?
Of course, please. And there is also one over
Oh,
there.
sorry. I have more beautiful hair than you. Yeah. So I'm not sure if this was mentioned because I had to leave the room for a few minutes earlier, but probably Jessica and Antonio, you are the ones who know the answer to this question. What is the pace of growth of energy consumption in Europe predicted for the next, 5 to 10 years? Do you have any information on that? Because of data centers and just growing need as, in the population and in industries. But I don't really know the number. I mean, how quickly is it growing?
I don't have the exact numbers, but I think there are two competing forces. I think we've seen some sort, and I think I have the numbers maybe for France because, and in fact, the demand has stayed quite flat. And when they are planning, they are also planning for a flat scenario, meaning you could think about the industrialization because of these prices that we see. So some industries just don't come here. So the demand goes down because the prices are a little bit higher. So the electricity demand just remains flat. And then if you have in between some sort of efficiency there, so that scenario is also, I would say, plausible if we keep having these high electricity prices in Europe. Then, of course, there are other countries with maybe the Nordics, the prices are so low, maybe there they have higher growth, but I've seen scenarios when everything gets flat because there is a deindustrialization approach. I didn't know the statistics from Devora. I really like that Europe only attracted you said 1/3 less than US in terms of data center investment. No, they attracted less, right?
We're talking about the number of the global data center presence, right?
Yes.
Was 15% 2024 versus 45% in the US.
Yes.
So it was a third.
It's a third,
Right.
yeah. So I think you will have an increase in demand, but maybe not as big as maybe the US. And maybe everything boils down to the prices. So again, to make it simple, I don't have the numbers, but there are competing trends, and maybe the prices at the end of the day make not the industrial demand be so big.
But the third,
Yes.
the pricing of the third, essentially it's the current status, but it's not necessarily a reflection of potential for the future, right? I mean, I think that's the whole conversation. It helps us to recognize that Europe is behind in the game today, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's what's going to be in the future. And that's where the policy and the collaboration comes to play a part. And of course, the types of energy. So
It's about if we really attract the industries, right? If we attract them, and maybe at the end of the day, is the cost of this electricity. So I would project an increasing maybe of data centers, an increasing demand, but again, everything boils down to the fact if you have cheap electricity elsewhere, maybe you go there.
I don't have the figures off the top of my head, but the Commission has done some modelling in terms of energy demand for 2050. We commissioned a report from Compass Lexicon, so if you come to me afterwards, I can tell you where you can find that report. But at the same time, we have to take into account several factors. I mean, first of all, the cleanest and the cheapest source of energy today is actually the one we don't use. So a lot has been done in terms of energy efficiency. Obviously, with cost of energy being high, industries have tried to make their processes more efficient so that they consume less. Buildings as well, there's a lot of renovation happening to make buildings more energy efficient. And so, of course, that has decreased the amount of energy that has been consumed. There have been crises as well. So, I mean, for example, in COVID, there was a drop in production. So clearly energy consumption decreased at that point. But I think in the future, what we're actually going to see is going to perhaps be less of a decrease or an increased energy consumption, but a massive shift towards electrification. So the change is going to happen around the type of energy that's being used. And that's where really electrification is going to be the primary source of energy consumed in Europe. Electric vehicles, as I mentioned earlier, heat pumps for homes, and then where you can electrify industrial processes, carbon capture and storage as well. One of the things with CCS technology is actually very electro-intensive. So as industries that can't electrify their processes shift to carbon capture, that's also going to lead to an increase in demand for electricity. So I see also quite a significant shift in terms of the type of energy being consumed and produced.
Yeah, hi, I'm Zsolt from Hungary. What I wanted to ask, and really reflecting back to what's been said before about what policymakers and their liability to actually represent science rather than ideology, and hearing fear-mongering happening, and you see a lot of, well, let's say, online influencers talking about this is bad, that is bad, whatever. But what happens if the policymakers themselves are the fear-mongers? We know of one on the other side of the pond, but for example, it might be an urban legend because it's recent news that Hungary just opened up again for wind energy. But for many, many years, it wasn't really permitted. And the urban legend, and I really want to call it urban legend, I don't want to say this is a fact. I've heard it from a lot of places, and no one could have ever, kept me more honest on this. But what I've heard is there's a certain first lady who was driving from Hungary to Vienna, crossing the border, seeing all the wind turbines, and she started having a headache. And since that time, the wind turbines have not been permitted in Hungary. And that's history now. And like I said, it may be an urban legend. But what I wanted to get at is what happens if the policymakers, and is there anybody who could correct the policymakers when the policymakers themselves are the fear-mongers and are just against science? Is there anything we can do? Because, otherwise the lights will go out. And, thank you.
I just have a joke. I was just going to say, you're lucky that she wasn't drinking beer when she got a headache, or all of Hungary would not be allowed to drink beer anymore. That was all.
Yeah. Yeah. But coming from the nuclear side, we're actually in the one country that's causing us a headache, because, I have to say it, because, yes, Austria remains very ideologically opposed to nuclear. The reality is at EU level, the treaties are very clear on this. Each member state is free to choose its own energy mix, so it is what it is. But I think it also comes back to the public, and this is where we're seeing a real shift, and that's actually influencing policymakers. The public themselves have started to ask questions about whether what they were told about nuclear was actually true. And as a result, we're seeing a massive shift in public opinion heading favorably towards nuclear. It's partly to do with the current situation that we find ourselves in today. Let's be quite honest about it. People are having to live with the effects of poor policies and poor decisions. And so if the public are more vocal and are more actively calling policymakers to take responsible decisions and then holding them accountable if they don't, that could be a way of getting around it. Unfortunately today, though, I think we're heading into a more confrontational form of policymaking. Then, we are seeing people voting for extremes on both sides. It's probably also to do with the fact that the public are just not happy anymore. I think that's probably part of where it's coming from. But I think the public really need to start speaking up, and they need to make sure that their voices are being heard, and then ultimately policymakers will follow because they get elected by citizens. So yes, if you believe in nuclear, if you believe in renewables, then make sure policymakers know this.
Also, the influencers or lobbyists, they haven't been elected, so it's not elected officials. So that's definitely, a different side to it. But they're looking out for essentially the good of the people or giving the people a voice. And so it's one way to look at it. But at the same time, the voice has to be one that's based, like you said, on science, based on an understanding of what's happening. We've seen data center projects stop being built because of this lobbying. And so, it's a question. There's a good intention there, and there's a good focus, and it's an understanding that communication needs to happen around new industries or new sciences or new technologies. But at the same time, that can affect the economy as well. And so we have to, I don't know where I guess we'll experience that now, and we'll see that more, but I don't know where the line will be drawn.
Could NGOs have maybe a role to play in keeping things in the right direction, or?
It depends on the NGO. I think currently there is a lack of transparency as to who is financing a lot of the NGOs. So if you open up transparency on who is funding an NGO, and though you're very clear on who is backing them, then yes, NGOs can play a role. Unfortunately, we are seeing that more and more NGOs are being utilized for lobbying, and that is an issue. I think, we do need to make sure that all voices need to be heard, but we also need to have transparency on where that voice comes from.
Yes, I have a question concerning the different termini you used, Antonio, especially in your presentation, because you were talking about CCS, and this is actually a term out of the Green Deal definition of the European Union, because carbon capture, sequestration or storage. So, and in the same sentence, you were mentioning gas storages. So, is this kind of because these are two different pair of shoes, right? So the one is like storing the CO2, because a lot of people were talking about CO2 capture, which is actually a Green Deal technology. And then you were also talking about the gas storage, where you can actually use the methane, and store it into a kind of a depleted gas field and then use it probably for later electrification. And this is actually I would say the paradox we are living in, right? So we have two different policymakers, right? Of course, Chevron has easier production rates out of the shale gas to provide electricity. We have to tend to a sustainable, climate neutral energy policy in the EU. And I hope very much that the Green Deal will come to fruition, right? Because I think this is a very big responsibility for the European Union to really work on a concept where we can implement a sustainable energy policy where we take responsibility also for the climate change. So for capturing CO2 in a very advanced technology. And this is actually the place where we have to push more into this direction, I guess.
What I said, the problem. So what I meant with gas plus CCS, you can do coal plus carbon capture and storage. Even with coal is easier because the difficulty of this is the concentration of the CO2 in the exhaust. And because it's the capture, and that's why you consume a lot of electricity, because this process needs, the capture process is also, you need to consume a lot of electricity, and the higher concentration of CO2, the better. So you can have the capture in the industries is easier. For example, cement, the concentration of the stream of CO2 is so high that then the capture is easier than in other technologies. So here what I meant was gas, because the emissions are lower, plus the carbon capture and storage. The issue here, I mean, you still have this dependent to gas with this technology. You solve the emissions, but where the gas comes from, maybe it's from US, so the sovereignty part is not, or the exposure to gas price is not eliminated with this solution. But it's true that it leverages a supply chain and processes that are already well known, and there are definitely places where you have an existing infrastructure. It doesn't make sense maybe in the US, makes sense in Texas, for example, where you have already CO2 pipelines or that oil and gas infrastructure that could be used for that. And in Europe, you have some hubs. You have hubs in UK, you have Northern Lights in Norway, so it's really an option. But the difficulty, again, of this is you still have the exposure to gas, and then the integration to all of this it can be complex because you need to deal with the the production, but then you need to align the capture part, and then you need to align the storage part. And then if you want, in some projects that I've done for some clients, monitoring the CO2 in the value chain is crazy. So that's it's not impossible, but if you want to sign a PPA for CCS and you want to demonstrate that it's low carbon, is more complex than in other projects because you have a lot of pieces that it's not impossible, but it's just, I also seen that demonstrating and measuring the CO2, the leaks in every step is not obvious. So I'm not ruling out this option. It's just, it needs, the difficulties, the integration, and then of all these processes, and then maybe some clients may have some requirements about emissions, some thresholds, and really maybe you just reach them if you have not 90% capture, but 95 plus. You know, there is also another thing, is the methane leakage. If your client cares about this, then you need to procure from a very clean, you need to do a due diligence. You don't need to procure from any place. You need to really understand where you're procuring from your gas. So you just see how this could be. It's a solution, but can be also policy heavy. Because if you are putting requirements on methane, okay, so I need to then limit in my options also to gas and things like that. So just, I answered your question, I believe, but I also provided some sort of light of what is CCS and what are maybe the difficulties.
Hello, thank you. I'm Vince Asfi, and I'm the CEO of a smart sensor production company for the smart grid systems. And actually, I want to have a question what we always talk about. When will be the lights, also when the lights going out? And that is actually why I'm asking, because most of the time we don't know what is happening in the grid. We just estimate, but there are a couple of systems where we can be able to predict where will be the power out. Because most of the time the power is there, but the grid cannot hold it. There is a lot of strain on the power grid. And I think it is also important, not only the resources, but how we manage these resources and how we put the power plants and where we put the power plants. And I only want to ask your opinion about it, how you think is it important, and actually we really know when the lights go out in Europe or somewhere else in the world, because I think it is important.
I think the example from South Africa was, I learned a lot. Thank you, David, because I didn't know it was so bad. As I said, I don't think, saying that we are going to have a blackout again, I think there are many things you can do in between you have a full blackout. I really like what you are saying is about how you manage. And I think the main issue in what is going to happen, I think in the future, is that the electricity system is going to become more complex. They are going to have more renewables. So the way you are going to manage the grid is going to be key. I do believe there has been mismanagement in Spain. And then there is also, you can, as you said, you can understand where you have more strain, where the grid is weak for whatever reason. And then you have these queues of renewables and projects. So what I've seen is that you could select, but again, this takes time. But in terms of saying first to come, first serve to the grid, you could evaluate, okay, what this project brings in terms of grid services. So maybe at some point you could say, okay, you're proposing to connect this here. I have a bottleneck on the grid, and you're proposing solar plus a battery. Okay, makes sense, so you come first. So this process of just picking the project that brings more value to the grid, I think is going to start to happen more. Of course, if firm capacity, the better. What? Yeah, it's like, yeah, it brings, like, for example, if there is that node in particular in the grid is suffering because you have a lot of solar and not backup. Because can be local, because I don't know, you don't have the gas plant nearby. So maybe there is a project that brings some storage, and you just give priority to that because that eases the strain on the grid. That could be a criteria.
The lack of utilization may also be a reflection of the need. So then you have all the storage, and then what happens? And you have to. I feel like there's a lack of capitalism in that model. Maybe I'm wrong, but essentially, then you start to have to think of the storage and where are you transferring it to, and how are you selling it. So in the end of the day, there will be a capitalistic model to it because you'll be selling the extra energy out, but utilization. So you're saying, like, that's what I'm asking you. When you're saying now, there should be an understanding of what would be suited to that specific needs, placement, and so on.
Yeah.
What does it mean? What does suited mean, right? Like, who's going to decide what makes it suited?
I think the planner, the grid planner, is going to decide based on what are the needs of that. And the needs is I think the question. It's really that, that specific node or place maybe could suffer. I don't know. If I take the example maybe of South Africa, there may be regions where the load shedding was higher than others because of whatever. There was not a mismatch of supply and demand in that specific. So they are going to prioritize those places with a specific project. Especially, I would say, I would argue maybe in some regions you have a lot of solar and less backup, and then is when there is more strain and the grid is suffering. To balance everything, they will prioritize one kind of project over the other. I think that is a model that I think we are going to see in the future, and it's about and he was suggesting is about how you plan, how you manage. Not the technology itself, it's just how you plan and you manage the grid when you have a lot of renewables in the system.
Yeah, from grids, and this is something that the EU has identified. One of the big issues with grids is the amount of money that is needed to invest in them. And so we've got the clean energy investment strategy where the priority there is